What if I told you the secret to stopping a famine? It has almost nothing to do with growing more food. It's about something else entirely, something political, something powerful, something that completely rewrote the rules between a government and its people.
So here's where we're headed. First, we're going to really dig into what a famine actually is. Then we'll look at this old colonial playbook, and spoiler alert, it put profits way ahead of people. After that, we'll compare two massive droughts to see what really changed. And finally, what all of this means for us today.
Okay, so first things first, we need to challenge a really common assumption. What is a famine? Because the reality, well, it's a lot more complicated and, honestly, more tragic than most of us think.
When you hear the word famine, what comes to mind? Probably empty fields, no food anywhere, right? A total lack of food. But the history of famines, especially in India, tells a very different and, frankly, a much more shocking story.
This gets to a really crucial idea from the economist Amartya Sen. He called it entitlement failure. And here's what it means. The food is actually there. It's in the markets, it's in warehouses, but people lose their power to get it. Think about it. If you lose your job or your crops fail and you have no income, your wages have collapsed, you've lost your entitlement to that food. You can literally starve while surrounded by plenty. And this idea, man, it changes everything.
So to really appreciate the modern solution, we have to go back and understand the old problem. And for that, we're going to look at the official rulebook, the playbook really, for how the British Raj dealt with famines. And check this out. There's this official report from 1880, and it's just incredibly revealing. It basically says the government was more worried about fiscal results, the bottom line for its shareholders, than it was about preventing the inevitable loss of life. Let that sink in. The number one priority was profit, not people.
So in response to all this, the administration came up with something called the Famine Codes. And, on the surface, the plan sounds kind of reasonable, right? They'd provide jobs through public works, pay people cash wages, and only give direct handouts to folks who are physically unable to work. And here's the kicker. They made it a rule not to interfere with the private grain trade.
But underneath it all was this core philosophy, this thing called the self-acting test. And honestly, it was a pretty brutal piece of social engineering. The whole idea was to make the relief so awful, think grueling labor for barely any pay, that only the absolute most desperate people would even consider it. It was basically a filter designed to save the treasury money, not to save lives.
And this policy led to a really shocking paradox. Think about the railways. They were new technology. They could rush food into a starving district. But because the government was so committed to protecting free trade, those exact same railway cars were often used to carry grain out of that same starving district, shipping it overseas to get higher prices in, say, London. So you have this amazing technology, and it's serving the market, not the starving people.
Okay, so let's jump forward in time. We're past independence now. But the threat of famine, it was still very real. And in the mid-1960s, a terrible drought in the state of Bihar put the new independent Indian government to its first major test.
So in Bihar, this catastrophic drought hits, and food grain production plummets by about 30%, a huge shock. And yet the government waited and waited until late April of 1967 to officially declare a famine. Now, why is that so bad? Because it's dangerously close to the monsoon season, when heavy rains would make relief work almost impossible.
The response, when it finally came, was just too little, too late. It was hesitant, it wasn't enough, and tragically, people died who didn't have to. It was like the ghost of the old famine codes, with that deep reluctance to act decisively, was still haunting the halls of government.
But then, just a few years later, something happens. An even worse drought hits another state, Maharashtra. I mean, all the signs were pointing to an absolute catastrophe, and yet the outcome was completely, totally different.
Okay, so let's put these two crises side by side. If you just look at the initial shock, the rains failing, the crops dying, agriculture just collapsing, the drought in Maharashtra from 1970 to 73 was every bit as bad, maybe even worse than what happened in Bihar. The natural disaster itself was on the same scale.
But this is where the story takes a sharp turn. Just look at the response. In Bihar, the relief programs employed, on average, maybe 450,000 people. In Maharashtra, at its peak, that number was 5 million. That's not just a little bigger, that's more than 10 times the scale. We're talking about a response on a completely different level. I mean, the scale is just mind-boggling. They provided 1 billion person days of paid work. That's one of the largest public relief programs in human history. And remember, this wasn't a charity handout. This was a direct attack on that entitlement failure we talked about. It was about giving people wages so they could buy their own food.
So you have to ask, what drove this incredible response? Was it just a brilliant top-down decision? Nope. It was immense pressure from the bottom up. This quote here says it all. You had laborers, local politicians, activists, and a free press all screaming for action. They were holding the government's feet to the fire.
And this really brings us to the heart of the matter, the core lesson of this whole story. The real change here wasn't just better logistics or smarter management. It was a complete, fundamental shift in what a government's responsibility to its people even is.
Think about it. The initial problem in both cases was exactly the same. The rains failed. You can't control the weather, right? So if the disease was the drought, what was the vaccine? What was this miracle cure that led to such a radically different outcome in Maharashtra?
This slide really nails the total change in mindset. On one hand, you have the colonial objective, which was basically a cold, hard fiscal calculation. Okay, let's prevent starvation deaths, but let's do it as cheaply as possible. On the other hand, you have the modern objective, which was a political compulsion. It was about upholding a citizen's right to survive, a promise that, if broken, would have them voted out of office.
So there it is. The vaccine wasn't some new super crop or a fancy new weather satellite. It was a political cocktail. It was a democracy where politicians were more afraid of angry voters than they were of budget deficits. It was a free and active press shouting about the suffering. It was a clear strategy to give people back their purchasing power. And most importantly, it was this powerful idea that survival isn't charity, it's a right.
And you know, this piece of history, it's such a powerful lesson for us today. It really forces us to ask a tough question. When we see food crises happening around the world right now, are we really looking at a failure of crops, or are we looking at a failure of politics?